Hello, welcome, and thank you all for participating in today's program. I'm Jenny Luray, Vice President of Strategy and Communications at Research America, and I am so pleased to be joined by an impressive panel of FDA experts with hands-on experience as advocates, congressional committee staff, and FDA leaders. So in alpha order with me today is Clay Alspach, who's the principal at Leavitt Partners, Remy Brim, Principal Co-Head Health and Life Sciences Practice, BGR Group, Annie Kennedy, Chief of Policy, Advocacy, and Patient Engagement at the EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases. Mark McClellan, who will be joining us shortly, is the director of the Robert J. Margolis Center for Health Policy at Duke University, and also a Research America board member. And last but not least, John Taylor, president and principal for compliance and regulatory affairs at Greenleaf Health. And you can find their bios in a link in the chat. So I also would like to take a moment to thank our Alliance member partners on this event. We've had a number of them, and I'm going to recognize them also in alpha order. The EveryLife Foundation for Rare Diseases, GlaxoSmithKline, Horizon Therapeutics, Johnson & Johnson, the National Health Council, Pharma, and Regeneron. So I'm going to take a couple of moments just quickly to set the stage. We can all say a big happy birthday to the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, known by its acronym PDUFA, because it's 30 years old this year. And by the way, I did check on Wordle, and PDUFA is not a word. I'm thinking of petitioning them, but it's not a word. But it is commonly known as PDUFA. And following the success of PDUFA, separate user fee authorizations now exist for medical devices, for generic drugs, and for biosimilars. But today, we'll be focusing on the grandmommy, granddaddy of them all, PDUFA. So it was initially inspired by the US Patent Office's model for reviewing patent submissions. Just over half of the FDA's budget is provided by annual appropriations, and the remainder comes from the user fees. PDUFA must be reauthorized every 5 years, and this round is PDUFA 7. So today, we intend to clarify what's in PDUFA 7. We're going to hear a little history because it's really important to see how PDUFA has evolved over the past 30 years. We'll review a number of key regulatory policy issues and better understand the reauthorization process. The FDA is very important to Research America because it's the bridge that connects research-based patient innovations to patients and their caregivers. Good news, we will be extending this an additional 30 minutes, so there will be plenty of time for Q&A. That means we'll go until 3:30, and many of our panelists will be able to stay with us. This program's off the record, so we can have an informal exchange, but reporters are welcome to contact me or our panelists afterwards. Okay, so let's get started. John Taylor, I'm going to start with you. You were the acting deputy commissioner and the counselor to the commissioner during Peggy Hamburg's term as commissioner, but you also have a very long family history with the FDA. So I wanted to ask you, what was the motivation for establishing the user fees in '92? I mean, what was it like for drug approval before PDUFA? John?
Yes. Very much, Jenny. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on PDUFA 1 and its origin. So as Jenny noted, in 1992, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act amended the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and that is commonly known as PDUFA 1. And what that amendment did, what that change to the act did, is it gave FDA the authority to collect fees from industry and use the revenue to support the review process for human drug applications. The grant of the authority provided FDA this new revenue source, fees paid by pharmaceutical manufacturers, to supplement their appropriations, not replace them. So as Jenny noted in her opening, these fees were never meant to take the place of congressional appropriations. They were merely meant to supplement them. And the rationale with it was that this new revenue source would allow the agency to increase its staff so it could essentially finish new drug applications reviews sooner. And it also required FDA and industry to agree on performance goals and targets that the revenue would support. Now, the origin of PDUFA really, the results of PDUFA and its origins had to do with the fact there was dissatisfaction on the part of industry, patient advocates, and the agency itself. All agreed that it took far too long prior to PDUFA's passage for the agency to reach a final decision on a submitted drug or biologics application. And as a result, Americans' access to innovative new medicines often lag behind other countries. And if you recall, this is a period of where new cancer therapies were coming to the fore, is a period of HIV, and there was a desire and a need to make sure that medicines were accessible faster. In the late 1980s, central to Jenny's question, the median time for review and approval of a drug application was 29 months. And patient advocates argued quite rightly that a drug in review and therefore unavailable for patients could be the difference between life and death. Manufacturers argued that prolonged review times prevented them from recouping their investment in research and development. And I think during PDUFA 1's consideration, FDA itself estimated that each 1 month delay in a review's completion cost a manufacturer $10 million. So those are two of the considerations that among many that were in play. FDA attributed the delay to the fact that it just simply could not hire, support, and review staff, both to look at the applications, both the new applications and also the backlogged applications. And they also didn't have staff that could establish the procedures and standards that could help set up and ensure a consistent and predictable pre-market review process. And FDA argued that it needed this new revenue source to do that. Interestingly, FDA had been asking for user fees 20 years prior to the passage of PDUFA 1, which is a little known fact. So they had been asking, and industry, however, opposed user fees, because if you recall, well, some of you are probably too young to recall, but in the 80s, there were huge deficits, and industry was fearful that these fees would end up in the treasury and be used for deficit reduction, as opposed to the actual review of new drugs. The impasse was broken under Dr. Kessler when the agency agreed to two of industry's major concerns demands. One was the demand for performance goals, i.e. setting targets, completion times for various review processes, and also reaffirming the promise that these fees would merely supplement FDA's budget and not replace it. So once that impasse was addressed, it set the stage for the passage of the bill, and it has revolutionized the way that FDA has conducted its drug reviews. As I noted previously, it took 29 months prior to the passage of PDUFA to complete the review of a new drug application. Today, the median approval time for a new medicine is just 10 months for standard applications and 8 months for priority applications. So clearly it's had a profound impact. So just one other point they'd like to make, and Jenny noted this in her opening, is that PDUFA has been reauthorized on 5 subsequent occasions. So PDUFA 2 was reauthorized in 1997, PDUFA 3 reauthorized in 2002, PDUFA 4, 2007, and that was in the backdrop of drug safety. And what that PDUFA agreement did is it actually broadened involvement and contemplated a role for shareholders and others, and took the process away from the bilateral process that had been used before then. PDUFA 5 is in 2012, an emphasis on accelerated approvals of breakthrough therapies. And PDUFA 6 was authorized in 2017. And that authorization lapsed in September of this year. And that's the reason PDUFA 7 needs to be reauthorized by Congress so that these review processes will continue. And I just want to note for PDUFA 6, again, because so many of you are in the patient advocate community, one of the great things that PDUFA 6 did is it formalized inclusion of patient experience data. So that's just one of the very elements. So that's my little bit of background on the history of PDUFA before and after, and the foundational benefits that it's provided.
John, that is super helpful. Thank you. Really important context. And we'll be talking more about the patient-focused drug development program later on. So before PDUFA 7 got to the Hill, which it did, I think it was in late August last year, there was a very long period of time where the FDA worked with industry to develop the commitment letter or the agreement letter. Could you speak briefly about that process? And Clay, I think I'll have you come in as well after John touches on it.
Yeah, sure. Just generally speaking, Jenny, as I said before, performance goals and targets, sort of the centerpiece of the various PDUFA agreements. Initially, FDA negotiated these goals and targets with industry and presented them to Congress in a letter, but it was not included in the act. So it was submitted to Congress, but it was sort of cross-referenced. And that was the case for PDUFA 1, PDUFA 2, and PDUFA 3. PDUFA 4, however, took the agreement and used it to actually amend the act. So there's actually a section in the act now that has a requirement for the goals letter, consultation, public communications. And again, that's when the process became less bilateral and open to other stakeholders. So to answer your question, indeed, there's a negotiation process between industry and the agency, but there also are public meetings, the providing of minutes from those meetings that allow stakeholders, others to comment on the draft final agreement. Then that draft final agreement, when it is agreed upon by the agency and the other stakeholders, is then shared with HHS for their review. And the Office of Management and Budget at the White House also has an opportunity to review it. Once all that is done, the Secretary of HHS then takes the agreement and its contents and also reports and other things that might be due to Congress and provides them to Congress, specifically the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee. And Clay and Remy can talk a little bit more about that process. But obviously, we're at the period where those committees will then have hearings, they'll mark up, and that will form the foundation for the larger process for the reauthorization legislation that will reauthorize PDUFA 7. I'll hand it over to Clay and Remy.
Thanks, John. Clay, anything to add on the agreement letter process?
Yeah, nothing to add on the process. I think John covered it so well. Just that under statute, they're required, those requirements, it's required to be done by January 15th. And those legislative recommendations come to the Hill, come to Energy and Commerce, come to Senate Health. And that's what happened with PDUFA. We have seen with other user fees where that has not been met, but PDUFA has traditionally always met that deadline. And so it's now pending before Energy and Commerce Committee and Health Committee, and happy to share more about kind of where that is at the appropriate time.
Okay, great. Yeah, we're going to get to that in 1 minute, but I want to turn to Annie because the public comment period is a critical period for patient groups to be involved. And I wanted to ask you about that, Annie. How has EveryLife been involved? How has that process changed? Can you talk a little bit about the public comment period and the role of patient advocates?
So I think really the way, it's more than just a public comment period. So I think I'd really like to talk about the way that all of the partners who are part of this process engage with the patient community. And it really has, certainly as John talked about, FDA has held public workshops, but also all of the partners who are part of the negotiations from the regulated trades to FDA formally engage with the broader community, which has been incredibly important. So I went back actually into all of the emails and my calendar to really look at when that started, because I feel like this is an evolution. And as John talked about with each cycle, then there's really a process of implementation and looking at the implementation of the performance goals and ensuring that there's iterative interaction between all the stakeholders as those are implemented. And then we sort of re-up and we look at then, looking ahead to now what's happened in PDUFA 6 and what we want to lean into in PDUFA 7. Formally, the leaning into PDUFA 7 started in the summertime of 2020, and FDA invited all non-industry stakeholders, so that included patient advocacy groups, healthcare professionals, academics, anyone who was interested to express their interest in participating in consultation meetings that the agency was going to convene. They convened monthly consultation meetings over a period of about 5 months, I believe, where they really reported out on their performance goals from PDUFA 6, and then invited comments and commentary and input from those who had indicated that they wanted to engage. So it was a very iterative process over that time period. They also solicited from those of us who had said that they were going to engage in that process. They wanted to know what we were leaning into and interested in PDUFA 7. So again, there was this very open process. It was fixed on our calendars that we needed to be there monthly. And that really did help inform then those open public workshops that John talked about that FDA convened with the broader community. I would say there were probably 150 groups that responded to that Federal Register notice. So it was a very broad stakeholder group that was engaging with the agency as the agency was reporting out on the performance goals. I did go back to sort of look at what some of the key themes were, and we're going to dig into in a second what we're seeing in PDUFA 7, but I do think it's worth looking at what FDA heard from us in those early meetings as we look at what came out back from the agency and the regulated trades. So some of the key themes in those early meetings included, we wanted to see clear processes for reporting out patient experience data information that was submitted to the agency for the benefit of the broader community. So those were things that in the summer of 2020, we said we were interested in. We were interested in transparency around how patient experience data is used in regulatory decision-making. As we looked into PDUFA 7, we were interested in steps that can make externally led patient-focused drug development findings even more impactful. And we were really interested in opportunities to increase cross-agency collaborations, looking at opportunities between FDA, NIH, and CMS. So those were some of the themes you were hearing from all of the different stakeholders and partners. We were also interested in looking at how patient-focused drug development could evolve beyond CDER to CBER. So again, we'll dig into some of that, but I think it's also important to say that we also, as community stakeholders, engage not just with FDA, but we also engage with the trades, who are also looking to hear from patient communities as to what our priorities are, so that when they all come together, hopefully they're singing off the same song sheet in their negotiations. And then, as you said, there are Federal Register periods where we can bring our comments forward, but hopefully that's not the only time our communities are weighing in and providing testimony, that we've all participated all throughout the process.
Thank you, Annie. That is a really good summation of the extent to which the patient advocacy community is involved. And I know it's grown over time, and you've certainly been a leader in that. So let's talk about where we are now in the reauthorization process. So I think I'll turn to Remy. What actions have been taken to date in the House and Senate? And then Clay, will have you jump in. Remy?
Sure. Well, as John and Clay mentioned, there is a statutory deadline for these letters, as we call them, the user fee letters, the user fee agreements, to get to Congress. On the PDUFA side, it did arrive on time. So that was the letter, as John mentioned, is sort of an agreement between FDA and industry on, I call it the nitty gritty of the funds, X $1 million and 3 cents go here. What does FDA agree to do in 9 days versus 11 days? All of that nitty gritty is in that letter. But then Congress actually has to turn that agreement into a law. So they have to make sure that FDA can actually take those funds in. And it's also an opportunity for Congress to look at FDA holistically. And we're going to be talking a lot about that throughout the next little over an hour of, it's a once in every 5-year opportunity for Congress and all the members to say, what are the FDA issues that are top of mind? So I know today we're going to be talking about sort of lessons learned from COVID, accelerated approval, patient involvement, as Annie mentioned. But all of this sort of kicks off with hearings in both the Energy and Commerce Committee with jurisdiction in the House and the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, or HELP Committee, in the Senate. As is typical in previous reauthorization cycles, the House is a little bit out in front. Clay will take great pride in that. As a former House staffer, the Energy and Commerce is moving first. They held a hearing on the drug-related user fees, so PDUFA. We're not talking about them today, but there's also one for generic drugs, GDUFA, and one for biosimilars, BsUFA. All those bills were discussed with FDA on February 3rd. And then earlier this month, they met again to talk about potential additional pieces of legislation, those sort of other things that Congress is interested in. And that happened on March 17th. So they considered bills, on a gamut of issues: accelerated approval, clinical trial diversity, advanced manufacturing technologies, talking about all these different member priorities. We expect them to turn to the device user fees on March 30th, so just this week. Again, that's PDUFA with the fourth sort of leg of the chair. And then, they're going to take all that information from those hearings and then work behind the scenes as staff to figure out which of these potential legislative ideas are sort of non-controversial and could help gain votes for them. Things that are really controversial can make them lose votes. So the staff has to have a careful balance on exactly what can be included in this, along with, as John mentioned, that language that sort of ties that negotiated letter to the law, and all of the date changes, all of the nitty-gritty, commas and decimal points in terms of the fees. All that has to be gathered together. On the Senate side, they're a little bit further behind, but that is typical because there are less formal procedural hurdles they have to clear. And in addition, the Senate Help Committee just passed out of committee a large bill called the Prevent Pandemics Act. That was focused on sort of COVID-19 response, but it did include several FDA provisions. And so those staff have been very hyper-focused on getting that bill through. Now that it's done, we expect them to notice the first hearing focused on the user fees to be occurring next week. That will be stakeholders, including folks in the drug space, talk about not just the actual agreement, but also all those other FDA drug-related issues. We expect FDA to come up and testify in front of the Senate after the April recess. So that would be the week of April 25th. And they're aiming to have that bill out of committee by Memorial Day. That committee is also dealing with some bigger FDA issues that are outside of the drug space, but have been priorities for a long time. That includes things like cosmetics reform. How do we regulate the cosmetics in this country? For any of you that have your FDA law book, it's about this thick. And of that big book, it's about 7 pages that regulate the entire cosmetics industry. So Congress has been looking at that for a long time. It's a longstanding priority of Chairman Pallone on the House side, and Senator Patty Murray, who's the chair of the Health Committee, and Ranking Member Burr are looking at a cosmetics framework. They're also looking at how to regulate diagnostic tests in America. That would also be a large overhaul. Again, not in the drug-related space, but important to bring up because there's the same sort of 4 staffers who have to work on all of these different issues. And when you have 2 of them sort of deeply invested in doing some of these bigger items as well, you can imagine what a big task this is to get this done on time before September 30th, and really before August 1st is preferable. But I'll stop there and let Clay talk a little bit more about how the staff works together to actually get these done.
Yeah, and Clay, if you could also touch on, given that this authorization takes place every 5 years, you've got new committee staffers and new staff of committee members who have to quickly get up to speed. So could you talk a little bit about that as well?
Absolutely. Yes. So while when I mentioned earlier, January 15th is the kickoff point when the letter comes forward, there's a significant amount of work that happens behind the scenes and before that time related to FDA issues. Remy mentioned cosmetics, some of the other pieces. Those have been worked on for decades. I can remember working on that in 2008 when Chairman Dingell put out a Food and Drug Administration Globalization Act. So some of the work just continues, but there's a tremendous amount of work that'll happen related to it to help that education process that you mentioned, Jenny, especially at the committees of jurisdiction. I know in 2012, that was when FDUFA was passed. I would argue we actually started this process in February of 2011 with our first hearing, where we were looking at some of the issues that come up every 5 years, where are we in competitiveness related to the rest of the world and on drugs and devices. And so there's a tremendous amount of work that needs to happen because increasingly, I would argue, there's turnover related to members and staff. And I think that's one of the I think issues that we'll be watching throughout this reauthorization process is that turnover. Because I think in 2017, one of the benefits was the cures process had just happened. So there was a tremendous amount of understanding among staff as well as committee staff, as well as committee members at Energy and Commerce and Health related to the issues. And that helps tremendously, not only in expediting the process, but frankly, I think getting better policy because there's that level of understanding, and the discourse and discussion around the policy is at a better understanding, and that generates better policy. Whereas now we're about 5 years removed since FDARA. And so with that, we have seen turnover, tremendous amounts of turnover. And that's not only the committees, but I want to raise also that we also have to look at the General Senate and as well as the General House as well. And I think that's one of the issues that and is going to be really important for folks on that are participating in this phone call and webinar, as well as the broader community, is that education process. Because I think because of that turnover that has happened, there's a significant education deficit, I would argue, on these issues. And what that means is it will make it much more difficult in the Senate and the House to get this through. It's not just a slam dunk that once it passes Energy and Commerce and Health Committee, it's going to get done. There's going to be an extensive and arduous process for Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member McMorris-Rodgers, as well as Chair Murray and Ranking Member Burr, in order to navigate those processes through the House and Senate. And that's where I think the folks in the patient community, especially that Annie can speak to so well, is so important, that to ensure that those members understand how important it is to reauthorize on time and what it means to the patient communities as well as to constituents in order to get this done. So just something for us to all consider. And I know we're planning to talk further about that.
Thanks, Clay. John.
Hey, Jenny, can I add to Clay's point? Because it's so important. I mean, Annie talked about the role that she and her peers play, but the educational piece is so important. So, I was deputy commissioner when we did FDAJA, and we worked with Clay, but even Jenny Ireland was the head of Ledge at FDA at the time. And we actually, because there had been so much changeover in terms of staff, we actually had an event at the agency where we invited all the staffers to come out. It was like speed dating. So they would have all the senior managers at FDA at different tables, and staff could switch and ask each senior manager from each program questions. And then after a period of time, you move on. And then we did a lot of intensive education on the Hill. We went to the Senate every week and the House every week. And Clay's point, for the first few PDUFA, and I've worked on all of these authorizing piece of legislation, except for the first one. And for the first few, there was very little change on the Hill, both in terms of members and staff, an incredible amount of continuity. But I think around FDAJA, that changed. And so the way we operated had to change because of that, a lot more onus on continuous education. So Clay's point is so important. I think it's one of the reasons why also having broader stakeholder participation is important, because lots of different people providing a lot of educational services can help offset the lack of institutional knowledge among staffers. And that's not talked about, but it's a big factor in terms of producing successful pieces of legislation that reflect the collective goals of all of us.
Thanks, John. I want to take a moment to recognize Mark McClellan, who has just joined us. Mark served as commissioner of the FDA. Mark, what kinds of activities did you do to educate members of Congress and staff when you were at the FDA?
Well, a great question to start with, and it's great to see so many of my former colleagues. One thing I did was depend on people like John and Clay, who are very knowledgeable on these issues and able to communicate effectively about them. But Jenny, I do want to emphasize just how important these steps are. This is a complex area of regulation. It's one in a time when not that much stuff is really moving on a bipartisan basis that has been able to preserve not only bipartisanship, but some real meaningful content. And we're going to get more into that in a few minutes. There's a lot here. There's a 70+ page commitment letter for the PDUFA program alone. So there's a lot of activity here, really important. And in some ways, there's not really a shortcut, but it is important to have communications that anticipate questions or concerns that are going to come up. Some of them are the, sort of the basic questions have been around since the start of this program. Hey, are these resources going to FDA from industry having the wrong kind or an undue influence? And And the best way around that concern is, number one, look at the evidence on what kind of impact that these programs have had on reducing review times, and been some studies on overall very positive impacts on health outcomes and time and cost of medical product development. But also how to have, through a public process like this, checks and monitoring of just what's going into the program. So thanks for doing this meeting and for continuing that important tradition.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for joining us. Well, I want to pivot now to COVID-19, which has impacted so much federal policy, and talk about what impact it's had on the commitment letter, and we think it will impact the process going forward. Remy mentioned the bipartisan pandemic preparedness bill, which could potentially be added to PDUFA. But for example, one factor that was attributed to the speed by which the COVID-19 vaccines were developed was that FDA reviewers and industry scientists had real-time communication. And a number of people, many people have talked about that as being critical to really getting those vaccines out the door to patients quickly. What are we seeing in this agreement around changes in communication between the agency and industry? And any other changes that you think reflect our COVID-19 experience? Mark, do you want to start with that?
Sure, be happy to. And we saw a lot of communications have to change very quickly, both in terms of frequency, dealing with development of vaccines, which is an incredible success story of what the benefits are when there is clear communication among regulators, the scientific community, product developers, to lay out a clear path, to do it not just on a national basis, but a global basis, to combine that with steps to do advanced purchasing of products before we even know if they work, while still making sure we're putting into effect really good platform clinical trial capabilities. Doing all of that in parallel was really important, and I think we're still haven't yet learned those lessons, adopted those lessons in much of the rest of biomedical development. But I think there's some provisions in the content of the user fee agreement letter itself, like around distributed studies and the like, that are relevant there too. Maybe we can come back to that. But just in terms of the communication, no question that this led to more frequent communication among public health emergency priorities. I think the question you have to ask when you're trying to take that lesson back to, post or semi-post pandemic or endemic times is how much of that was a shift in resources away from things that just had to become more urgent, like vaccines. There have been significant delays in many user fee dates and so forth as a result of this, and how many of these lessons really made the process more efficient. I think one of the key things that FDA learned, I think is reflected in the commitment letter, is that it is possible to do more things virtually than you might have thought before. So virtual inspections I think are going to be a key part moving forward. That's more efficient and enables FDA to leverage the bang for its buck on its resources. You have to be careful about how you do it, but we just had tons of experience and are getting more experience now on how to do that effectively. And the other thing I think there's been some learning on is how to run meeting processes between FDA and sponsors and how to incorporate that. So I think there are some revisions in the process for these interactions, virtual or otherwise, that are intended to make them more efficient. And then also, as I don't want to get into too many broad issues here, but learnings about, a lot of the trials that we did in the pandemic were just too small and too slow and not systematic enough to have a big impact on learning. There were a lot of gaps in evidence on diversity of populations being treated that I think we're learning from. So hopefully we can come back to some of that too. But I do think there's some at least incremental impacts on how to do meetings better, how to rely on virtual technology, virtual approaches and the like that have helped.
Thanks, Mark. I think let's move into some of these regulatory policy issues, and we'll start with those that do have to do with clinical trial design and the use of technology. So real world evidence, the use of data generated in real world medical practice versus a traditional clinical trial. How is the FDA using real world evidence now? And how could PDUFA 7 impact its use? Mark, we'll start with you. And then I know a number of other folks on this panel have worked on that issue as well. So we'll turn to them next.
I think the user fee agreements have been instrumental in moving forward real world evidence going back to at least, 2007 PDUFA, if not earlier, around that user fees set up the initial Sentinel program, expanded that post-market systematic evidence program that was initially used for some pilot areas and limited areas for safety surveillance. Now is not only a much broader resource with much better understood data and methods for safety surveillance, but has extended into other applications, including some questions of effectiveness, some use during the COVID-19 public health emergency. And it's also led to analogous extension programs and biologics, the BEST program, and efforts underway at CDRH as well. I think the most important things in the more recent legislation, though, go to extending out the use of real world evidence much more systematically beyond safety to beyond issues like how to design trials and thinking about, what kinds of event rates are you going to see and where do you need to go to find and engage the right diversity of patients into questions about expansions of labels, including subgroup effects, further data on effectiveness outcomes that are hard to measure in clinical trials, and questions related to effectiveness. If you think about like the last 10 years, first we got a lot of experience with safety, then FDA through the user fee acts had a lot of resources to engage experts, stakeholders in developing a way to think about real world evidence more systematically. It's turned out that data issues are really important. A lot of people focus appropriately on, well, much of real world evidence doesn't come from randomized trials. I'll come back to that. But a lot of the issues around clinical trials, which makes them reliable, is that you really understand where the data is coming from, and it's not missing very often. And it's, the blood count or hemoglobin level isn't coded in 85 different ways. And we've seen a tremendous amount of work thanks to the user fee acts around guidance and better understanding of the underlying data and whether data are fit for purpose. Similarly on methods, what kinds of approaches can give us confidence that if you can't do randomization, you can approximate the results of clinical trials. And FDA's supported a lot of studies on cases where we know what happened in clinical trials, and we're trying to apply real world non-randomized evidence methods in those circumstances. And I'd add to that, as we get to trial platforms and the like, if we've got better data, if we've got a better understanding of the completeness of the data in the populations, it's even possible to think about more real world clinical trials. That's what point of care trials kind of are about, that can rely on existing data systems that are not tremendously disruptive to frontline clinicians, that can bring in data from patients that are also used in their more routine tracking of their own health and the health care they're receiving. And all of that's been made possible through guidances and investigations and support in the last couple of user fee rounds. Looking ahead, I think what may be most important is taking these guidances and moving them more systematically into actual pilot efforts, actual new applications in different areas of clinical development, going beyond safety questions alone, to give us a better understanding of how to apply all this learning in more systematic approaches to bringing real world evidence into part of the overall totality of the evidence that FDA relies on. Real world evidence has always been part of that. It's been particularly important in areas like rare cancers, rare diseases, but we've now got some opportunities to learn a lot more. And within the user fee agreement is the establishment and expansion of of an advancing real world evidence program. That's got to start, intended to start by the end of this year, close to it. And then identifying within this program some pilot opportunities and approaches for actually showing that you can meet FDA regulatory requirements. We're not talking about changing the regulatory standards, but building on all this knowledge that we have about improvements in data and whether it's fit for purpose, about what methods are appropriate to use or fit for purpose for getting the right answers and not biased answers. There are going to be annual reports in the years ahead coming from CEDAR and CBER about all of this, public workshops, and again, a more transparent process around some of these pilot cases to show whether and how real world evidence can be used more systematically in practice.
Thank you, Mark. I want to just give a shout out to the Margolis Center, which you run, because it has really been one of the leaders in really developing approaches around real world evidence and doing a lot of really key convening. So I think we're going to move on to some other regulatory policy issues. I'm keeping my eye on the time. And we want to get to cell and gene therapy and advanced manufacturing, et cetera. But I did want to come back to patient-focused drug development. John sort of helped to locate where along the past 30 years it really kind of came into being. Annie, can you talk about how PDUFA VII builds upon patient-focused drug development?
Sure. I want to put a little bit of what John and others have said in context, though, through the lens of patient-focused drug development for just a moment, because I think some important facts and stats have been thrown out that I want to underscore through our community's lens and the patient community's lens. So there were some stats given about pre-PDUFA and our lives now that we have PDUFA or the UFAs that I think are important. And there was a really important call to arms for the community to make sure that we're talking to our elected officials and to Congress about the importance of PDUFA. And I think we need to make sure we frame this a little bit. So before PDUFA, and John mentioned this and others mentioned this, more than 70% of new medications were first approved outside of the US. And so we're talking about now clinical trial innovations, what that means for our rare and non-rare patient communities when products are being developed outside of the US. Since PDUFA, that has shifted, and Research America probably has more updated stats, but I believe now that close to 80% of medications are actually first approved in the US. So there's a milestone and a marker for PDUFA working. John also gave a stat that prior to PDUFA, on average, it took 29 months to review a new drug. So I just want to remind us and layer in that it takes, on average, 15 years to develop a drug. And so that stat he's giving isn't the development time, that stat was the review time. So once the clinical trials were completed and the package had been submitted to the agency, that was the amount of time it took the agency to then review what had been provided by the drug sponsor to the agency. And just through the context of the rare disease community, the lifespan of many of those of us with rare diseases, once you're diagnosed with a rare disease, isn't even 29 months. So if you qualified for the clinical trial and were fortunate enough to be in the clinical trial and had a product you thought worked, you were waiting to see whether or not access would be afforded to others. But if you hadn't met the inclusion criteria, that time span for the review meant another generation of patients living with the disease would come and go before FDA had the ability to review whether or not that product was approved. So when we talk about the review timelines and the incentives and reinforcing the infrastructure at FDA to actually increase the timelines, increase capabilities, increase infrastructure, we're talking about lives saved. Mm-hmm. So I just want to underscore the importance of, as a patient community, engaging to make sure that FDA has the resources they need to in order to review products. And really, what an amazing ability we have now to actually inform what that infrastructure does as we look into these next PDUFA agreements. And so to your question, when we look at that evolution of what happened in PDUFA 4, PDUFA 5, PDUFA 6, we're following this evolution of what we now talk about as patient-focused drug development. And we throw that around like a term we're all so used to, but it didn't used to exist. And we talk about patient experience data, which in PDUFA 6, patient-focused drug development was codified as a part of FDA's mission for the first time because of PDUFA 6. When you think about what came out of PDUFA 6, because of the way we all engaged together and because of what came out of that, and now with PDUFA 7, we're leaning into that even further. In PDUFA 6, patient experience data became a thing. And when we think about COVID, and just going back to some of what Mark was just reflecting on, what we learned was that data sharing in ways that were previously said to be impossible could happen overnight. And that patient experience is actually expert data. And we saw it informing in real time what we were learning about an unknown disease and informing what we were accepting in clinical trials, what we were sharing about treatments and therapies in real time. And that if we have unmatched resources and innovation, we can solve public health crises. And so that's what, again, when we look at PDUFA 7, what we're looking to do, how do we take those innovations and learnings and apply them now, what we're leaning into going forward. So when we look at PDUFA 7, so coming out of PDUFA 6, the themes were patient-focused drug development. We had patient-focused drug development workshops where for the first time we had communities coming together to look at what outcomes were of importance to really inform therapeutic development across the spectrum of therapeutic development. We looked at collecting comprehensive and representative input. For the first time, we were really engaging in a very constructive way with the agency. And we talked about clinical trial innovations. All of that's being codified even further in PDUFA 7. In PDUFA 7, real world evidence, which Mark just did a beautiful job talking about, Bayesian modeling, looking at adaptive trial designs. Bayesian modeling, for folks who don't know what that is having a more dynamic statistical modeling so that we can be learning as we go in clinical trials, which is especially important for small trial populations. And then enhanced engagements with some of the existing infrastructure at the agency, moving patient-focused drug development from just the Center for Drugs, but to cell and gene therapies, to CBER, because of how much is in the pipeline and how much innovation is needed within CBER. And then all of this advancement that Mark just talked about with real-world evidence so that we can ensure that we're moving just from guidances to pilots, and that real-world data collection, which will help improve diversity as well in clinical trials, will help inform decision-making, not just in clinical trials, but also in the access environment and in the post-market setting. So I'm sure we'll dig into all of that further, but patient-focused drug development means that patient experience, patient engagement is now the center of everything that we're doing in therapeutic development. And so we just cannot underscore enough the importance of, if you're a patient group or a patient community listening today, engaging in this process and ensuring that the science of what we're doing is a part of these discussions and negotiations and reflected in what we're talking about here.
Annie, thank you. Wow. Patient-focused drug development would not have developed to the extent to which it has without your advocacy and the advocacy of other patient groups. I mean, it really is a wonderful, example of what advocacy can do to really change policy. You mentioned cell and gene therapy. It's called out in the agreement. Can you briefly say what the agreement would do for the resources for cell and gene therapy?
Sure, I can start, and then I know others will talk a little more broadly, but I can start. So one of the things we were really excited about was to see the evolution of especially patient-focused drug development into cell and gene therapy. There are specifically within the agreements, it talks about strengthening staff capacity and capabilities specific to CBER. There are guidances, so there's really this rhythm that really looks at conducting workshops and then taking the learnings from the workshops and then publishing guidances. So we see that in a couple different places. We see that similarly when looking at enhancing the reviews of cell and gene therapy products. So there will be a guidance around the evaluation efficacy in small populations using novel trial designs and statistical methodology, which we're really gratified to see. And then a public meeting looking at how to capture post-approval safety and efficacy data, and then again, subsequent guidances. So again, this is a real challenge in cell and gene therapies because these are durable treatments, and how do we ensure that, again, we're building these learning healthcare systems and capturing data in the post-approval setting. So these are the things that we're seeing in PDUFA 7 as we anticipate cell and gene therapy to be a really incredibly important field.
In the interest of time, I'm going to bounce from that to something which is very related, which is advanced manufacturing. So that's a term that's also being tossed around a lot, but it is directly related to the boon in cell and gene research and cell and gene therapy applications. So John, could you talk a little bit about the intersection of the two, and also what's in the agreement around advanced manufacturing?
Yeah, so I mean, so the idea of advanced manufacturing has actually been discussed for years. When Mark was commissioner, we introduced the Pharmaceutical Quality for the 21st Century Initiative, and Dr. Woodcock and I chaired it, and that was 2002. I think 2004, as early as that, we started talking about the benefits, potential benefits of advanced manufacturing, looking ahead to all kinds of issues like manufacturing capability, it's as a possible tool in addressing and mitigating drug shortages, improving quality, and then later looking ahead to the idea of cell and gene therapies and using this advanced manufacturing to manufacture maybe a therapy for one person or a smaller set of patients as opposed to traditional manufacturing, which was geared towards these huge amounts of volume that were geared towards these blockbuster drugs that were not necessarily individualized in nature. So, this has been discussed for a long time. I think, some of the other advantages, and just keeping it at a high level, I've talked about, but the real promise is one, if it's a more automated process, there's a likelihood of less human error resulting in high quality. It can respond more nimbly to market changes, which goes to drug shortages. It also can meet higher demand as a part of reducing drug shortages. And the automated monitoring, these 2 points, I think, were part of our initial talking points, is the automated nature of the process controls allows you to determine if there's a problem with the product sooner, i.e., in the traditional manufacturing scenario, often it's your final product testing that allows you to determine if there's a problem with the product or a batch of products, and then you have to discard them, which leads to waste and also additional costs. As part of a more advanced automated process, you can actually intervene sooner and then make adjustments to correct the manufacturing process so that there's an earlier interdiction, which leads to less waste and better quality. So these are some of the traditional things that were discussed. But I think the reason it's being discussed so widely now is because in the midst of the pandemic, agency leadership talked about it as a potential solution for the current pandemic and for future pandemics. And if you go back and look, you'll see Dr. Hahn talking about it a lot. You see Dr. Woodcock. You'll see Dr. Marks. And one of the things that they talked about was the fact that, because pandemics and other emergencies are, inherently unpredictable, and there's a need for manufacturing that can be adaptable, one for capacity reasons and for shortage reasons, they viewed advanced manufacturing as an opportunity to strengthen supply chain and improve response capacity. And so I think that's the reason why it's gotten so much attention, even though it's been a long-standing issue. And you're right, it is in the PDUFA 7 agreement. There's a specific provision that's meant to look at how to advance both the utilization and implementation of advanced manufacturing. And there's going to be a public workshop and I think a white paper that comes out of that. And by the way, kudos for the PDUFA 7 agreement having quality provisions in them. That's sort of the first time. And that's just something that traditionally has not been. And again, I think the reason this is so important because, a lot of whether it's cell and gene therapies or any other modality, there's a lot of time and attention spent on the need for good clinical practices and good research and so on and so forth, all of which is very important. But one of the challenges that we saw during the pandemic is you can do all that, But if you don't have the manufacturing capacity, then access doesn't occur, right? And so I think the reason that this has garnered so much attention, both in the context of PDUFA 711, but also in the context of the larger legislative discussions, because as Clay and Remy pointed out, the House is already looking at certain provisions that would impact this, and the Senate will undoubtedly do the same, is because I think it's just such an important tool, both inside and outside emergencies, and it's going to be, I think, crucial for helping to ensure that the cell and gene therapy, promise comes to full realization. I think back to cell and gene therapies, one of the difficult things is how you scale up from a manufacturing standpoint these products. It's very difficult. And one of the things I like about the cell and gene therapy provisions in the PDUFA agreement is calling for additional resources for guidance that can help us better understand the manufacturing issues and how to scale them up. And also guidance that right now, and I'm not being critical, but there's a lot of a tendency for information to be shared between FDA and a sponsor. That information is not necessarily widely available to other developers and other interested parties or the patient advocates. And so I like the fact that that guidance can take some of that input and make it more available as part of fostering this promising technology. And I think that guidance can also help, taking it full circle, provide guidance as to how advanced manufacturing can help overcome some of the challenges that are involved in manufacturing and scaling up these cell and gene therapy products. So that's a little bit of why I think it's been so prevalent, even though it's something since Mark's reign as commissioner.
Thanks, John. We're actually going to lose Mark shortly, so I want to bring you back on. We haven't yet talked about accelerated approval. We have a number of other things, but what would you say about PDUFA 7 is in terms of its importance?
Well, very
that
important.
We haven't yet touched on. Sorry.
Yeah, just to build on a couple of the comments. This goes for cell and gene therapy, advanced manufacturing, adaptive trials. The legislation has some really good provisions in it to help move things forward, but we need to have some public discussion now, and hopefully that can inform what we actually do with these provisions if and when they're enacted. And John's excellent discussion of just how important advanced manufacturing is. John, we started a lot of these projects back in 2002. I was honestly hoping we'd be a bit further along than we are in moving to these automated process controls, which have the side benefit of enabling manufacturing processes to be updated faster and more confidence about safety. Boy, that would help with drug shortages and responding quickly to new threats where you need to manufacture a vaccine or a monoclonal antibody or another advanced biologic product. So hopefully we can add to the momentum in these provisions with steps like that. And it goes for cell and gene therapy too. And basically for many of these cell therapies, you're making this bespoke, very individualized, very complex product. And that means a lot of opportunities for things to go wrong without these kinds of automated process controls in place. Peter Marks highlights, obstacles 1 through 10 in getting cellular therapies out faster, more reliably, are really related to reliable advanced manufacturing. On adaptive trials, the steps around Bayesian methods and using kind of all the evidence we have as efficiently as possible are really good, but I am still concerned that we have more work to do around getting more active, meaningful participation in clinical trials. That was kind of a big miss with the pandemic. Our collaborators at the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative and others at a review of all the studies that were undertaken, most of them didn't lead to sufficient power and clear answers to clinically relevant questions. And today in the United States, the vast majority of patients, especially from diverse backgrounds, are not participating in meaningful platform trials. So I think there are steps we can take to bring down the cost and the burden of participation, both on the frontline provider side. We have a lot of burned out providers today, even though lots of opportunities with electronic data that we understand better to generate more evidence, and a lot of patients, as you've heard, who want to participate. So all of this means that it's, while important as the user fee legislation is, there are other steps too. And there will almost certainly be other legislation that moves along with the PDUFA and other user fee legislation this year. Some of that relates to the topics that I just described, maybe future pandemic preparedness, incentives to create more reliable manufacturing. Some of it relates to accelerated approval, where we've got concerns as usual on both sides. We're going too quickly. We're not generating especially enough long-term evidence. We're going too slowly. We need to expand out the program. So the common ground solutions that hopefully can be in the bipartisan legislation, like the user fees, would be steps that can improve on both sides, maybe more reliable ways to generate evidence more quickly through, for example, better platform trials and clearer guidance, and also maybe more expectations that we're going to get that evidence. One final thought I'd like to leave with is that these user fee programs, the Cures legislation, has been fantastic for transforming capabilities at the FDA to keep up with the science and provide clear and timely guidance. In contrast, we haven't seen anything like that happen once products really reach the market and get to those important coverage and payment issues. The staff at CMS, the agency that I led after FDA, that oversees all of their coverage decisions for devices, software, drugs, advanced medical products, is actually smaller today than it was 15 years ago when I was commissioner. And that gives them a really impossible job. So I hope we can, through bipartisan legislation, build on the user fee provisions to take some other steps I think would be very helpful in achieving the goals of the user fees. And thanks for the opportunity to be with you all today.
Mark, thank you so much. And thank you for also raising CMS, because that juncture between regulatory approval and payment is key to access.
Yeah, it's getting more and more important.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we'll say goodbye to Mark. We've got lots of questions. And Mark referred to Cures, and Clay, we're going to open it up to audience questions, but I did want to get in a question about Cures 2.0 and whether or not there will be aspects of that incorporated into PDUFA 7.
Yeah, it's a great question. So Remy mentioned earlier, Energy and Commerce Committee had a hearing on drug-related riders. Cures 2.0 was included as part of that legislative hearing. And when you look at Cures 2.0 and what's in the legislation, you're seeing a lot of parallels, not only, frankly, a lot of parallels to the base PDUFA agreement that the fellow panelists have gone so deep into. For example, cell and gene therapy, that was one section of Cures 2.0 that's frankly spoken to in the PDUFA agreement. And so I think that's one where, as the committee staff and as the committee members look at what rides along with the user fee, the riders, there will be that discussion on, are some of those provisions in Cures 2.0 similar to and therefore should ride with it? As you know, as others know, Cures 2.0 is broader, so it includes some of the CMS aspects, some of those issues that Mark raised related to just that communication piece and ensuring that CMS has its capabilities and has the ability to and has the knowledge in order to ensure that timely access. It also has provisions related to the pandemic, which the Murray-Burr legislation that they just passed a couple weeks ago also speak to. So I think it's still unclear, but clearly a lot of the topics in Cures 2.0 will be part of the discussion as Energy and Commerce moves forward.
Thank you, Clay. We actually got some questions when people registered, so I'm going to touch on a few of those and then we'll go to the ones that are live. Are there still advocacy opportunities on the horizon to shape PDUFA 7?
I'll take that one. I would say yes. The user fee letter itself is baked, right? It's been negotiated. There was a public comment process, and that is now to Congress. But in terms of advocacy opportunities, I know the letter is long this year. I think it's over 70 pages. It's the longest agreement letter we've had, and we've spent a lot of time talking about the extra things Congress could do, whether it's more legislation on real-world evidence, tweaks to accelerate approval. I mean, there's sort of a lot of conversations happening, But within the letter itself, and I think John and Mark, it really dug into this, and Annie, there's a lot in there. There's so much in there on manufacturing and how we use evidence and collaboration with not just companies, but other stakeholders as well. And to Clay's point, there's a lot of staff turnover. I think someone told me that on energy and commerce, at least on the Democratic side, there are no health LAs. That's the staffer that's in charge of this. There are no health LAs on the Energy and Commerce Committee that were around the last time. So there is no one staffing this who's done it before in those member offices. So when we think about advocacy opportunities, this is a must-pass bipartisan piece of legislation. There are not a lot of bipartisan pieces of legislation around Congress these days, and there's not a lot of things that get done on time. This is not something where we can say, oh, we don't have a deal, let's kick the can 3 months down the road, and let's do a CR, we'll do it, we'll do it later. This has to get done. And so for advocacy, I would say the number one thing to do is to, if there are offices that you're close to, or if there are specific people that, are working on issue areas that touch FDA, the message is just get this done. Don't hold this up, right? This has to get done. We have to find compromise. This is old school Congress, bill on Capitol Hill 101 type legislation. Let's figure out a way to get this done. Let's educate people on what's in this, why it's so important for the agency, and why it's so important to get done on time and not get caught up in all of the politics that we're all used to dealing with here in the Beltway. This is, this little bit needs some special sauce on it.
Thanks,
I just
Remy.
want to tag in on top of Remy just real quick. What she said was perfect. And I'm just going to add, we just had Rare Disease Week where we had over 900 advocates go to the Hill. And I think the most common misperception of Hill offices as advocates were talking about PDUFA was the belief that this is and something that the American taxpayers pay for. So I think, first of all, it's there. Not only is there time for advocacy involvement, there's really an imperative that advocates be involved based on everything I said previously. But then also just a reminder that this is not funding that comes from American taxpayer dollars, that these are user fees that are paid for by sponsors at 2 different time points during therapeutic development. We don't have to get into all the weeds of that other than to say that this is necessary funding infrastructure because FDA is grossly underfunded. And without this funding, we cannot move our therapeutic development pipelines forward the way it's needed. So there is an imperative that advocates be involved at this point to make sure that this gets done in the timelines that we've stated.
Thank you, Annie. And I'm pleased that we do have a number of Hill staffers who were able to join this session as well. And we'll be continuing to reach out. All right, so I'm going to ask my colleague, Sarah Chang, to join us if she hasn't yet, and help with lots of audience questions that we've gotten.
Yes, hi, thanks, Jenny. One, I'm going to start with Annie. This is probably for you, but for anybody to jump in. If we are to expand patient-focused drug development, how do we assure patients are engaged from the outset? And how do we measure the results from the patient perspective?
Oh my God, I love that question. Well, I mean, we always say patient-focused drug development happens early, often, and always. So one of the things that came out of, actually it came out of 21st Century Cures, technically it was provision in 21st Century Cures last time, which passed around the same time that PDUFA 6 was passed previously. So to Clay's point, there are really elements of Cures 2.0 that could be incorporated into PDUFA 7 because there are a lot of overlaps. There was something called the Patient Experience Data Checklist that was implemented at the FDA, because your question is spot on. It's one thing to say that something I have a colleague who says patient-centered, not patient-centered, but how do we really measure that patient experience data has been incorporated? And how do we know that that data has been submitted and then actually included in a review? So there's actually now a process at FDA where patient experience data is measured and it's transparent and there's a checklist that is completed, and then FDA puts out a report as to how that data is being utilized so that we have a feedback loop and we understand what data is helpful and what data standards need to be improved. So that's the first thing. There's now additional accountability and transparency, which has been a really powerful tool for everybody developing patient experience data as well. There were a lot of efforts internally at the agency and by sponsor groups looking at how we improve that in the how we operate within that framework, how we make sure it's easier for reviewers to find that data, how we make sure we're doing a better job of creating patient experience data, and how we make sure that engagement starts earlier as we're determining what endpoints we're using, as we're determining what outcomes we're collecting, so that we're not doing it too late in the process. And within the PDUFA 7 agreements, we did not spend a lot of time talking about this. There is a pilot program looking at the development of endpoints specifically within rare diseases. There's a lot of additional emphasis and acknowledging that good endpoints are necessary in driving innovation. So we're looking upstream. So that's incredibly important, and making sure that patient communities are a part of those conversations is incredibly important and reflected in the agreements. The other thing that's in the agreements when we look at advancing patient-focused drug development are workshops around methodology, around the submission of patient experience data, and within the context of benefit risk, which is incredibly important. So how we understand the context for a specific product and the population that that product is specifically targeted for. And so within these agreements, we see that theme coming through strongly, that we need to understand that better, and then the implications for that within a product's labeling. So there's a lot of that within these agreements. Also, to the point of, is there room for advocacy? At that Energy and Commerce hearing that Remy was talking about, Remy and Clay both talked about, that was convened about 2 weeks ago, there were a number of different legislative items that could potentially make their way into the final PDUFA agreements that propose to pull that through even further and make sure that patient experience data is incorporated into the benefit risk framework itself. So there's still more being considered that could be added and that are under discussion and being looked at by our congressional leaders.
Annie, that's a great, John, please.
Let me just following up on Annie's good point. I mean, I think something that gets lost here, and Remy and Clay have alluded to it as well, is that these very much build on each other. And so even if you're not able, I mean, at first, the first few PDUFAs were just mechanistic, right? They really focused solely on whether there were timely reviews and clearing the backlog. But since then, there has been, the scope has broadened, as we have discussed, and broadened a way to deal with, the very thorny and increasingly complex issues that surround drug development and review. And my only point being that if you're able to look ahead and build your story and figure out what your goals are, even if they aren't attained in this legislative cycle, there could be other legislative cycles, even before you get to the next reauthorization, that you can take advantage of. And so I think sometimes people forget or view these as all or nothing. But I think to Annie's point, if you do a really good job with your advocacy objectives, even if you're not able to attain all of them in the context of this reauthorizing legislation, that puts you in a good position to possibly insert them into another piece of legislation that could come up in between the now and the next reauthorization. And there have been obviously ample opportunities, since FDARA, there's been, CARES, and we have other bills that have been complex. So my only point is, I think that we've all illustrated sort of this cumulative building, but I think it's really interesting to hear it in the context of the patient advocates, because you have a sort of a beginning, like a clean beginning, and all that's been done since then has been pretty amazing and just builds on top of each other. And I think that's how everyone should view those issues that are important to them, is this building block. And I think that helps you plan and advocate better, for what it's worth.
Thanks, John. Sarah, I know we've got more questions.
We do. This one actually can be to anybody, but we've talked a little bit about some of the authorizing bills or some of the attachments that might ride along with PDUFA. But are there other ones that anyone thinks specifically will be added? The questioner here asks about VITAL and laboratory developed tests, but are there others that we should be aware of?
I'm happy to sort of take a first stab at that. I would think about it at this stage more as broad policy themes instead of sort of specific pieces of legislation, because the committee staff is still really digging in and figuring out exactly what that legislative text will look like. But I think broad strokes, we do expect, these so-called riders in a couple spaces. One, accelerated approval. Even in FDA's budget proposal for FY23, which was released today, FDA is asking for additional legislative authority that tracks pretty closely with some of the legislation we've seen from Representative Pallone that would require your study to be designed before you are able to be granted accelerated approval, and a couple tweaks around sort of FDA's withdrawal authorities. I would expect that there is something going to be included about clinical trial diversity. That is a very hot topic in Congress right now, and something that the agency has struggled with over the last few years. There was a study released, I think, in the last 2 weeks that showed that FDA's efforts that they sort of launched about 5 years ago have sort of led to no general change in the amount of enrollment of minorities in clinical trials. So I think Congress will want to take that on. You mentioned VITAL by name. That bill has to deal with sort of regulation of diagnostic tests. The sort of front runner sort of framework is actually not vital, but valid. That is a bipartisan, bicameral piece of legislation that the HELP committee is using as a basis right now to develop their framework for what would be sort of a modern clinical diagnostics regulatory regime. And so I think, those are some broad buckets. There's always, little tweaks, people talking about device cybersecurity, shortages. John talked a lot about advanced manufacturing, ways that we can improve the emerging technologies program at FDA. HELP committee has already put out in their Prevent Pandemics Act, a new pathway at FDA to be able to review manufacturing technologies outside of an individual product application to help de-risk the investment for companies that want to engage in some of these new novel technologies that FDA doesn't have a big track record with yet. And so I think there's a lot of these pieces and themes that we will continue to see hold together into that final piece of legislation.
One of the bills that a number of our Alliance member groups support, valid is one, but so is the PASTOR Act. So for those who may not know, that would provide additional support for the development of drugs and diagnostics to deal with antimicrobial resistance and enable the agency to have more resources in those areas. Any chance of that being, I'm not advocating that it should or shouldn't be, but I know there are folks on the program today who are curious to know if that might be added.
Yeah, I know it's part of the discussion with Cures 2.0. It's included. It was part of the hearing, at Energy and Commerce Committee, and it's such a vital topic as we talk about preparing for the next pandemic and some of the public health challenges that are coming forward. And I would just one thing to add to what Remy, I agree 100% with that. And is one thing to think about too is there's a lot of focus today around getting something into legislation. But one thing, just stepping back, there's a lot of authority at FDA and Section 505 or others, the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, where they can do things out of their own volition. And so as much as it's always great to get something in statute and to have that specifically to point to, there's a lot of work that can happen where FDA may be able to, on its own step forward. So it's something to think about as part of these discussions as well, about how the discussion around whether it's accelerated approval or others, it may not be a statutory change, but it may have an impact on culture, or frankly, the FDA may take steps on its own to effectuate it.
Can I follow on Clay's point? Can I follow on Clay and Remy's point? I'm going to make some, some guesses, and I'm sure I'll be wrong. I'm wrong a lot, but I also think an area of discussion, following on like Clay's point, had to do with some of these quality issues that Mark alluded to it, and Remy did as well. So in FDASA, and Clay was a great help and advocate for this. There were a lot of authorities they alluded to earlier that were meant to improve pharmaceutical quality and globalization, and a lot of those authorities were not used widely until the pandemic response. So for example, one of the big concerns on the part of patients is that products would not be approved because FDA and other regulators could not do on-site inspections. So some of the alternative approaches and the authority that was in FDASA was utilized by the agency for the first time. Broader cooperative agreements with other regulatory bodies. So if FDA can't get the facility, greater sharing, mutual reliance. these are things that were tried for the first time during the pandemic. And in some cases, to Clay's point, people are looking at whether there needs to be enhancements to that authority. In other cases, it might be just a question of rethinking on the part of the agency, the bounds of their authority. But one area in particular that I think at some point will come up is this whole idea of virtual inspections, which Mark alluded to. In the Act, the language of the Act sort of suggests that an inspection, you need to be on site, which kind of precludes you from having, quote, virtual inspections. But that's sort of just give me an example of an area where the agency might not be able to do it on its own, and therefore it might, require some of the ongoing discussions that might lead to a change that allows you to do that. I'm not advocating either way, but I'm just highlighting where the very pandemic experience itself has led to deep thinking. And so I think that some of these issues will be in the legislation on some level, but the final outcome is still a little unclear to me. But
Thanks,
I think
John.
it's so useful that people will want to consider them for the
Thanks. Sarah's going to ask an audience question about backlogs, but I just wanted to point out that FDASIA, every now and then, one of the reauthorization gets a different acronym just to keep people on their toes.
right.
So
Sorry.
FDASIA was a PDUFA. I can't remember which number, but number 5. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks. Yes. Has the FDA worked through most of the backlogs and reviews for new drug device and lab test applications that have been caused by the COVID pandemic? Is there anybody that can take that one?
I guess it depends on how you define backlog. I think John's wheel spinning too. I think when we think about from a super technical standpoint, they don't have a backlog. There is no sort of official backlog in the way the sort of FDA nerd world thinks about backlogs. But certainly, especially if you look at the number of lab tests that need to convert from an emergency use authorization to whether it's a 510K, a PMA. When you look at the work that FDA has to do, there's a lot of work to do. I think, Mark mentioned a lot of the collaboration that was happening between vaccine developers, therapeutic developers, test developers, and FDA. And that was great. They had a lot of interaction. The agency was involved, but that means the agency wasn't as involved in other places because they did have to shift resources. There was no more in-person meetings. In-person meetings still haven't really come back between developers. And so the conversations you would have, in your 5-minute break or your 10-minute break, and developing those real relationships are really important. And that hasn't been happening. And so I think what you're going to see, and a lot of the goals of PDUFA 7 are, again, and we talk about this every cycle, and John can speak to this probably better than I can. How do you get great staff? How do you increase the staff? How do you have the latest folks working on gene therapies? Because right now, when you're having, folks in CBER hyper-focused on helping transition vaccines from an emergency use authorization to a full biologic license application, they're not helping the latest gene therapy folks figure out how to manufacture and scale up, a gene therapy for rare disease, because it's the same people. And I think so when we think about backlog, I wouldn't call it a backlog, but it is, the need for the agency to figure out how to deploy its current resources as it continues to, try to staff up. And push those out beyond sort of the COVID focus and get those back to sort of the I don't want to call them the run-of-the-mill drug development programs, but the drug development programs that are for diseases that are not COVID, as those products have gotten much more experience, real-world evidence, whatever you want to call it, to help support full application.
Yeah, I think Remy did a great job. I mean, one of the challenges the agency has across many programs is, these EUAs were issued because of public health emergency. But at some point, the agency has to determine and provide guidance to companies whether, how these products be handled when the public health emergency is over. Many, and for the vaccines, obviously you're seeing a pathway where they will seek, final approval. But to Remy's point, for the diagnostics, CDRH has put out guidance, but that is no small task, right? Sorting through, and so that is something that's going to take time. And in the context of CBER, Peter Marks has been very honest about the fact that the cell and gene therapy efforts have not moved forward aggressively because he just doesn't have the people. Everyone in CBER, like, they borrowed from everyone to be able to do these tasks that were crucial to COVID. And that means that until that ends, there still will be, as Remy pointed out, this very delicate balance regarding the usage of resources and the prioritization of work. So I actually have to leave a little early, but
Okay, John, we're about to close. Thank you so much. Thank you. We are going to close. First of all, one thing I wanted to mention is that one of the things we didn't focus on was FDA appropriations, and that was on purpose because the regulatory policy issues and the PDUFA process was quite a lot to tackle in the time we had. But obviously the appropriations are critical. And I think everyone on this call, on this panel would agree that they have traditionally been grossly underfunded. We work very closely with the Alliance for a Stronger FDA. And we really look to their leadership and partnership on FDA appropriations. So I encourage you to subscribe to their email list. I'm sure Stephen Grossman is working over the FDA numbers. And we also had Steve and Brent Del Monte, a colleague of Remy's, on a session in December that was more focused on the FDA budget. So I hope you found this session helpful. We will be putting it online. Please reach out with any key questions that went unanswered. And let me just thank this incredible group of panelists. Virtual round of applause for Annie, Clay, Remy, John, and Mark. We are very grateful for your time and your expertise. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of those who joined us today.